Hi, my name is Keith Cooper from Northlight Images, and this is a short video answering hopefully a question I've been asked a few times about tilt-shift lenses. About certain aspects. Now these are all tilt-shift lenses here. There's some Canon ones and ones I use with adapters. But the question is, what happens to a tilt-shift lens when you put an extender in? Now it's an extender or teleconverter, and this one here is a Canon 1.4x Mark III converter. Works very well with lots of Canon lenses, and although it's not officially supported on some lenses, the colour of it suggests that it's usually meant to go with the long white lenses, it actually does work perfectly well. And the simplest aspect of this is what happens if you add a teleconverter to shift. Now if I take this lens here, this is the 17mm lens, tilt shift, so it has the tilt and the shift movements that I use. I've got lots more information explaining how you use these lenses, so this really is quite specific to use of these adapters and converters. If I put this between the tilt-shift lens and the camera, then for purposes of shift, it extends the focal length. It's exactly how you'd use it normally with a telephoto lens. 2x converter converts your 200mm lens to a 400mm lens. Now you lose aperture, maximum aperture with that, so you get 1 stop less aperture with this 1.4, and a 2x converter you get 2 stops less, but that's fairly familiar stuff if you've ever used converters like that. This is the 24mm Canon lens, and if I take an example here, this is a photograph. This lens has 12mm of shift, and if I take a 12mm lens, 24mm lens here, take 2 photos with 12mm of shift, overlay them on top of each other. This is how you do flat stitching with tilt-shift lenses. We can see that we have a particular coverage of a building here. So we've got the frame, and then we've got the second frame overlaid on top of it, and it gives you 12mm of physical lens shift and image shift. What happens when I put a converter on this and change its effective focal length to 24 to near 35mm? Well, the obvious thing is, if I'm using this just as an ordinary lens, this now behaves as a 35mm lens. I think it's 35, 34, something like that. It's in that order. And I lose a stop of aperture. That's fairly standard. Here's a view taken with the 24mm lens, with the 1.4 converter, and with shift. And that gives still physically only 12mm of shift with the lens. But that is magnified by the converter, so we get the equivalent of 17mm of image shift. So if I go back, that's 24mm shifted 12mm. That is 24mm times 1.4 with 12mm of physical shift and 17mm of image shift. So you can see that the focal length is multiplied, but also the shift is magnified, because the shift is happening before the converter, before the teleconverter does anything. So that's a fairly basic one for handling shift. You get a longer focal length, but you get more shift. That can be useful. A 1.4 with this is quite a useful lens. It works well with certainly the 24mm here. Doesn't change image quality very much, and it is one I use because Canon don't make a 35mm shift lens. The nearest they make is the old 45 or the current 50mm. Same with Nikon, you've got a 24mm. If you want a 35mm, you've got to find a lens that was last made in the 1970s. Likewise, Canon did a 35mm back in the 70s and the 60s as well. But yeah, we're getting back to old lenses there, quite difficult to find, and they really do show how much lenses have improved over the years in terms of general quality. Usable still though, but not something necessarily you'd want. Now that shift works very easily. What about tilt? Well, if I put a lens on, and this is the 17, this is on this camera here, and I can just undo the lock here so that we've got movement, and I can tilt the lens. You can see the lens tilt like that. Now that's, I've written loads of stuff how to use lens tilt. When you work out the movement of the focal plane, you need the focal length. And you might think, the focal length with the converter on it is now 17, it's going to be 24, or the 24 will be up to 34, 35 millimeters. Well, it happens that for tilt, the focal length is not changed for making your tilt calculations. The teleconverter magnifies the image, so the field of view is smaller on the same sensor. So you get a smaller field of view, an equivalent field of view of the longer focal length. But the tilt is happening, in this example, the tilt is happening before the converter. So for purposes of focusing and setting the lens up, it is still a 17mm lens in this case. There's no difference. It's a 17mm lens, but with a zoom on it, so you're getting a crop of it. So you do all your settings as if it was 17mm lens. Effectively, it all works as a 17mm. So for shift, you get a equivalent of a longer focal length, and you get an increase in shift amount, but in tilt, you get virtually no change. Obviously, the lens is further away, the movement's happening, it does change a bit. Now, I've written articles going into this in a lot more detail with lots of worked examples showing more detail than I can easily do here in a video. If you're interested in this, have a look at the articles, because I've got to say more detail in those. I've also got, I have to mention obviously, my book about how to use tilt and shift lenses. Contains stuff about this, contains basically everything I know about using tilt and shift type lenses of all makes. Not just these Canon ones here. Talking of all makes, there's one last bit I really need to mention, and that is what happens if I'm using an adapted lens with a tilt shift unit. Now, the one I'm thinking of here is, this is a photodiox adapter from Mamiya 645 medium format lenses to EOS Canon RF mount. That's the one I've tested this on. I've got a Z mount version of it as well for testing it on Nikon gear. But here we have a device that gives me shift and tilt. I can remember the right button. There we go. So that's with tilt there. Now this is a simple adapter. There's nothing in it. There is no glass in it at all. It's just an adapter from medium format lenses to a mirrorless camera. What happens if I put a Mamiya converter here? Now this is a Mamiya 2 times converter. This is a Mamiya 55mm 2.8 lens. Now I've done lots of articles and stuff about using adapted lenses. What happens when we do this? Well, in this instance, because the converter is before the tilt and shift unit, you get 55 times 2, so 110mm in this instance. So this becomes a 110mm shift lens, still with the same amount of tilt and shift, because the tilt and shift is set by this. So field of view is magnified, so it becomes a longer lens. And for tilt, you are now tilting a 110mm lens. You are not tilting the 55. It just depends on the relative positioning of where the converter goes and where your tilt and shift happens. So if you really want to, you could add this onto this, and you can stack converters and do things like that if you really want to and you're feeling a bit bored one Sunday afternoon. So there we go. That's the gist of it, of using tilt and shift. Anyway, hopefully that's of some interest. If you've got some of these lenses and you want to experiment a bit, please feel free to ask some questions. As I say, I've got lots more info in the book and lots of written articles which are where the detail is. So if you want to know a bit more about using them, just have a look at that. So hope this has been some use. Thank you very much.